I used to believe we had it all. Our small house in Austin, Texas, was humble but cozy, a place filled with laughter and warmth, or so I thought. Katie and I met during college at a campus coffee shop. She was the kind of girl you couldn't help but notice. Fiery red hair, an easy smile, and a confidence that made her seem larger than life. I was smitten from the moment she spilled her latte on my notebook. We married a few years later, and life felt simple and good. But looking back, maybe I ignored the small cracks that were always there. I worked long hours as a project manager for a construction firm, while Katie pursued her passion for photography. She often took gigs on weekends, weddings, graduations, baby showers. Her talent was undeniable, and I loved watching her chase her dreams. But somewhere along the way, I started noticing a distance between us. She was on her phone more often, always smiling at messages she never shared. Just clients, she'd say when I asked. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her. One Friday evening, I came home later than usual. The lights in the house were dim, and Katie wasn't in the living room where she usually waited for me. Instead, her laughter floated from the kitchen. I stepped in to find her on a video call. Her face lit up in a way that stopped me in my tracks. She quickly ended the call when she saw me, brushing it off as a chat with her friend Marcy. But something about the way her fingers trembled as she set her phone down told me otherwise. I didn't say anything that night. Maybe I was too afraid to face what I was starting to suspect. Instead, I convinced myself that I was imagining things, that the long hours at work were clouding my judgment. But the unease grew. I started noticing more details. The way she'd tilt her phone away when I walked by, the sudden trips to the store that lasted longer than they should, the faint scent of cologne on her jacket that wasn't mine. The breaking point came a month later. Katie said she had an overnight photography gig in Dallas, and I believed her. But something gnawed at me, a gut feeling I couldn't shake. I decided to call her hotel room that evening to say goodnight. When I did, the receptionist informed me there was no booking under her name. I hung up, my hands shaking, the walls of our home suddenly feeling like they were closing in. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. I spent that night awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for her to come home. When she walked through the door the next morning, she looked radiant, like someone who'd just returned from an adventure. I didn't confront her, not yet. Instead, I decided I needed proof. That's when I installed a small GPS tracker in her car, something I hated myself for doing, but felt I had no choice. If my suspicions were wrong, I could let it go and never tell her. But if they weren't, it didn't take long to confirm what I feared. A few days later, the tracker pinged her car at a motel on the outskirts of the city. I drove there, my heart pounding, and parked across the street. Her car was there, parked next to a sleek black sedan. I waited for hours, the anger and heartbreak bubbling inside me like a storm I couldn't control. When she finally came out, she wasn't alone. She was with a man, a tall, sharply dressed man who kissed her before they got into their separate cars and drove away. That image was burned into my mind, a scar I couldn't erase. I didn't confront her that night. Instead, I started gathering more evidence. Photos, timestamps, anything that would prove what she was doing. Maybe it was my way of making it feel real, of forcing myself to accept the truth. Katie didn't suspect a thing. She continued with her secret life, and I continued pretending I didn't know. But every smile, every touch, every word from her felt like a lie. I decided to confront her 2 weeks later. She came home from another work trip, her face glowing in a way that made me sick. I told her I knew. I told her everything I'd seen, everything I'd tracked. At first, she denied it, her voice defensive and shaky. But when I showed her the photos, her expression changed. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She just sat there, her face pale, and said, "I'm sorry. Sorry." That's all she had to say. She admitted to the affair, said it started months ago, and that she didn't know how to stop it. She claimed it wasn't about me, that she loved me, but the words felt hollow. I asked her if she wanted to save our marriage, and to my surprise, she said yes. I didn't know if I believed her, but part of me wasn't ready to give up. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was love. Maybe it was something darker, an obsession with fixing something that was already broken. We started therapy. Katie promised to cut all contact with the man, who I learned was named Eric, a client she'd met through her photography gigs. For a while, things seemed to improve. She was more present, more attentive, and I wanted to believe she was truly committed to rebuilding what we'd lost. But deep down, a part of me never trusted her again. And that part of me kept looking for cracks in her story. Katie was good. Too good, perhaps. In therapy, she spoke about regret, the shame she felt, and how much she wanted to rebuild our trust. She'd say all the right things, looking me straight in the eye, her hand gripping mine. But something about her sincerity felt rehearsed, as though she'd practiced the words before walking into the room. Still, I went along with it. I told myself that giving her a chance was the right thing to do, even if my instincts told me otherwise. After all, love isn't perfect, right? People make mistakes. The first few weeks after therapy started felt almost like a honeymoon phase. Katie went out of her way to show me she cared, cooking my favorite meals, planning weekends together, even leaving little notes in my lunch like she used to when we were first married. I wanted to believe her, but every kind gesture felt tainted by the knowledge of what she'd done. I couldn't shake the image of her and Eric at the motel. It haunted me, creeping into my thoughts when I least expected it. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching TV, I glanced at her phone on the coffee table. It wasn't locked, something she'd insisted on to show she had nothing to hide. The messages were innocuous. Texts from friends, emails from clients. But one name stood out. Marcy, her supposed best friend, the one she'd used as an excuse during her affair. My gut twisted. I didn't say anything that night, but I couldn't ignore the sinking feeling that something was off. The next day, while Katie was out running errands, I decided to look deeper. I hated myself for snooping, but I couldn't stop. I scrolled through her old messages with Marcy, searching for inconsistencies. And there was a message from weeks ago. Eric asked about me again. It read, Marcy's response, "Be careful." My chest tightened. She hadn't cut him off. She'd been lying to me, to the therapist, to herself. The fragile hope I'd been clinging to shattered in an instant. I confronted her that evening, my voice trembling with anger and betrayal. She denied it at first, her face a mask of shock and indignation. But when I showed her the messages, she broke down. She admitted she'd still been talking to him, but she swore it was only closure. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Closure? She wanted closure with the man who'd nearly destroyed our marriage? I walked out that night, needing air, space, anything to keep me from saying something I couldn't take back. I stayed at a motel that night, the irony not lost on me. As I lay on the stiff mattress, staring at the cracked ceiling, I felt something shift inside me. The anger that had burned so brightly was cooling, hardening into something else. Resolve. I couldn't live like this anymore, trapped in a cycle of lies and half-truths. Katie's betrayal had cut me deeply, but her inability to let go of Eric was the final blow. Something had to change, and I knew it wouldn't be her. The next morning, I returned home to find Katie sitting at the kitchen table, her eyes red from crying. She begged me to stay, to work things out, to give her one more chance. I'll block him, she said. I'll do whatever it takes. But her promises felt empty, like words spoken out of desperation rather than genuine remorse. I told her I needed time, though in my heart, I knew I'd already made my decision. I wasn't staying for her. I was staying for me, for a plan I couldn't yet articulate but felt forming in the back of my mind. I began to play along, pretending to forgive her, pretending to work on our marriage. She seemed relieved, throwing herself into the facade of rebuilding our relationship. But behind the scenes, I was preparing for something else. I started gathering evidence. More texts, emails, even photos of her and Eric from a private investigator I'd hired. It wasn't about proving her guilt anymore. It was about preparing for what came next. Weeks turned into months, and Katie seemed convinced that we were on the mend. She talked about renewing our vows, about starting fresh, as if those things could erase the damage she'd done. I nodded along, offering just enough enthusiasm to keep her convinced. But every smile I gave her was calculated, every touch was rehearsed. Inside, I felt nothing but cold determination. One day, I told her I had a surprise for her, a weekend getaway at a cabin in the hill country, just the two of us. She lit up at the idea, and for a moment, I almost felt guilty. But then I remembered the messages, the lies, the motel. I remembered the way she'd shattered my trust and my heart. The guilt evaporated as quickly as it had come. The cabin was secluded, nestled deep in the woods. Katie marveled at the view, her face glowing with excitement. "This is perfect," she said, wrapping her arms around me. I forced a smile, playing the part of the loving husband. That evening, we sat by the fire, drinking wine and talking about nothing in particular. She seemed so at ease, so unaware of what was coming. In the middle of the night, I woke her, my voice calm but firm. I told her I couldn't do this anymore, that I knew she'd never truly let go of Eric. Her face crumpled, her protest spilling out in a rush. But I didn't let her finish. I laid out everything, the evidence, the lies, the betrayal. "I brought you here because I needed you to understand something," I said. "You took everything from me, and now I'm taking it back." Katie's expression shifted from shock to fear as she realized I wasn't talking about divorce. I pulled out the folder of evidence I'd compiled and threw it onto the table. "This," I said, "is everything I need to ruin you." Her career, her reputation, her family relationships, it was all in my hands. I'd uncovered things she'd tried to keep buried, things that would destroy her if they ever saw the light of day. Katie stared at the folder, her face pale and her breathing shallow. "You wouldn't," she whispered, her voice trembling. But the fear in her eyes told me she knew I would. "You ruined us, Katie," I said, my voice cold. "Now, you'll see what it feels like to lose everything." I wasn't yelling. I wasn't even angry anymore. The calmness in my tone seemed to terrify her more than anything. She reached for the folder, but I grabbed it first, tucking it back into my bag. "You'll know when the time comes," I said. The drive back from the cabin was silent. Katie sat rigid in the passenger seat, her eyes staring straight ahead. I could see her hands trembling in her lap, but I didn't say anything. My plan was in motion, and her fear was the first step. She'd underestimated me for too long, treated me like someone she could manipulate and discard. But now, I held all the power, and I intended to use it. Over the next few weeks, Katie's demeanor shifted. She became cautious, walking on eggshells around me, trying to anticipate my every move. She started deleting texts as soon as they came in, but it didn't matter. I had already installed software on her phone to retrieve anything she tried to hide. She couldn't take a breath without me knowing, and the paranoia began to eat away at her. It was exactly what I wanted. I started planting seeds, small clues that would make her doubt herself. A random text from a fake number. A printed photo of her and Eric left on the kitchen counter. Each little push chipped away at her confidence, at the walls she'd built to protect her secrets. She'd ask me if I'd left the photo, if I knew who sent the texts. I'd feign ignorance, shrugging casually as if none of it mattered. Inside, I felt a grim satisfaction as I watched her unravel. Then came the day I knew everything would fall apart. Katie's phone pinged with a message from Eric, and I intercepted it before she could. He wanted to meet. She'd been trying to cut him off, but his persistence was relentless. Instead of confronting her, I sent a reply pretending to be her. "Let's meet at the park tomorrow. Usual spot." My hands didn't tremble as I hit send. I knew exactly what I was doing. The next morning, I told Katie I'd be working late, and she didn't question it. She left the house as usual, but I was already one step ahead. I followed her car, keeping a safe distance until she parked at a small park near our old college campus. She sat on a bench, looking anxious, glancing around. Then Eric appeared. He sat beside her, leaning in close as they began to talk. I watched from my car, my chest tight with anger and vindication. I didn't confront them. Not yet. Instead, I took photos, clear, undeniable evidence of their meeting. Eric leaned in at one point, brushing her hair back, and Katie didn't stop him. It was all I needed. When they parted ways, I followed Eric back to his car. He didn't notice me until I stepped out and knocked on his window. His face froze when he saw me, recognition and fear flashing in his eyes. I kept my voice calm as I told Eric I knew everything. I told him that if he didn't end whatever was going on, I'd make sure his wife, his boss, and everyone in his life knew about it. I didn't yell or threaten. I didn't have to. The look on his face told me he knew I was serious. "Stay away from her," I said simply, before turning and walking back to my car. That night, Katie acted like nothing had happened. She smiled as she set the table for dinner, asked about my day as though she hadn't just been with Eric hours earlier. It made my stomach turn. I let her finish her charade before I slid the photos across the table. She froze, her fork clattering onto her plate. "You didn't think I'd catch you again?" I asked, my voice eerily calm. Katie tried to deny it, to spin some story about how she was ending things with Eric and didn't know how to tell me. But I didn't care about her excuses anymore. "You don't get another chance," I said. "You're done." I stood up, grabbed the folder, and left the house. She called after me, her voice cracking with panic, but I didn't look back. I drove to a lawyer's office that same evening. The divorce process was swift and brutal. I had all the evidence I needed to ensure Katie didn't walk away with anything more than she deserved. The photos, the texts, the tracker logs, it was all laid out in black and white. She didn't contest it. By the end, she looked like a shadow of the woman I'd once loved, but I felt no sympathy. She'd made her choices, and now she was living with the consequences. Months passed, and life slowly returned to normal. I threw myself into work, reconnected with friends, and started finding joy in small things again. Katie moved out of the house and into an apartment across town, but I rarely thought about her anymore. She was a chapter I'd closed, a mistake I wouldn't make twice. But one day, I received an unexpected message from Eric's wife. She wanted to meet. Curious, I agreed. We sat at a coffee shop downtown, and she wasted no time explaining that Eric had left her shortly after our confrontation. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, her voice steady but cold. "You opened my eyes." I nodded, unsure how to respond. It felt strange, talking to her about something I wanted to leave behind, but I realized we were both survivors of the same storm. Meeting Eric's wife stirred something in me. It wasn't closure, exactly, but a strange sense of vindication. We both had been collateral damage in the same web of lies. And yet here we were, rebuilding our lives in the aftermath. She told me about how Eric had tried to explain himself, how his excuses fell flat. It mirrored everything Katie had said to me, every hollow apology that had done nothing to erase the pain. "I hope you're doing better now," she said before leaving. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. Life after the divorce felt quieter, emptier in some ways, but freer in others. I threw myself into work, picking up bigger projects and spending longer hours at the office. My coworkers noticed the change in me, offering the kind of hollow support people give when they don't know what to say. "You're looking good, Mark," one of them said. I forced a smile, but inside, I felt like a shell of myself. No matter how hard I tried to move on, there was a part of me that couldn't let go of what had happened. One night, I found myself scrolling through old photos of Katie and me. They felt like relics from another life, reminders of the man I used to be. I wanted to delete them, to erase every trace of her from my world, but my finger hovered over the screen. Was I holding on to them out of nostalgia, or was it something darker? I closed the album and tossed my phone onto the couch, the weight of it all pressing down on me. A week later, I ran into Katie at a grocery store. She looked different, thinner, her hair shorter, her face pale and drawn. She spotted me before I could slip away and approached cautiously. "Mark," she said, her voice tentative. "It's been a while." I nodded, keeping my responses short. She tried to make small talk, but I could tell she was struggling. Finally, she blurted out, "I just want you to know I'm sorry. Truly sorry." Her words didn't sting like they once would have. Instead, they felt hollow, like echoes of a distant pain I'd already started to leave behind. Katie's apology stayed with me longer than I expected. I found myself replaying her words, wondering if she truly meant them or if it was just another attempt to soothe her own guilt. Part of me wanted to believe she'd changed, that she'd learned from the fallout of her choices. But another part of me couldn't trust her, not after everything. Trust was something she'd shattered beyond repair, and no amount of apologies could fix it. In therapy, my counselor encouraged me to explore forgiveness, not for Katie's sake, but for my own. Holding on to anger only keeps you tethered to the past, she said. I resisted at first. Forgiving Katie felt like letting her off the hook, like saying what she did was okay. But as the weeks went by, I began to understand. Forgiveness wasn't about her. It was about releasing myself from the grip of the pain she'd caused. I started making small changes, redecorating the house, getting rid of old things that reminded me of her. I even adopted a dog from a local shelter, a scruffy mutt named Max who quickly became my closest companion. He had a way of grounding me, of reminding me that life could still be full of joy, even after everything. Slowly, I started to feel like myself again, like the person I'd been before Katie's betrayal. Then, one day, I got a call from Katie. Her voice was shaky, and she sounded nervous. I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, she said, but I need to see you. Just once. Please. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We met at a coffee shop near the old campus, the same one where we'd first met. She looked like a shadow of herself, her confidence replaced by something fragile. I wanted to thank you, she said, for everything, for walking away when you did. It forced me to take a hard look at myself. Her words surprised me, but I didn't let my guard down. I don't need your thanks, I said, my tone neutral. I've moved on, Katie. I hope you have too. She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. I'm trying, she said, but I'll never forgive myself for what I did to us. To you. For the first time, her apology felt real. But it didn't matter anymore. I didn't need her to forgive herself. I had already forgiven her. Not for her sake, but for mine. As I left the coffee shop, I felt lighter than I had in months. Meeting Katie had brought a strange sense of closure. Not because she'd apologized, but because I realized I no longer needed her validation. I was free from the weight of her betrayal, free to move forward without looking back. Max greeted me enthusiastically when I got home, his tail wagging furiously. I scratched behind his ears, smiling for what felt like the first time in ages. In the months that followed, I found myself rediscovering parts of life I'd forgotten. I started hiking again, exploring the trails around Austin with Max by my side. I even joined a local photography group, something Katie had introduced me to years ago, but that I'd never pursued for myself. It felt strange at first, stepping into a world that had once been hers, but it quickly became my own. One day, while photographing a sunset over the Barton Creek Greenbelt, a woman approached me, her camera slung over her shoulder. Her name was Emma, and she was warm, funny, and easy to talk to. We spent the evening comparing shots and sharing stories about our favorite places to photograph. For the first time in a long time, I felt a spark, something I thought I'd lost forever. Emma and I started seeing each other casually, taking things slow. She knew about my past, about Katie, and she didn't shy away from the baggage I carried. We all have scars, she said once. But that doesn't mean we can't keep living. Her words stuck with me, and I realized she was right. My scars didn't define me. They were just part of my story. As my relationship with Emma grew, so did my confidence in myself. I no longer felt like the man who had been betrayed and broken. I felt like someone who had fought through the darkness and come out stronger. Emma didn't try to fix me. She simply walked alongside me, letting me heal at my own pace. With her, I felt safe. One evening, as we walked along the South Congress Bridge watching the bats take flight, I realized something profound. Katie's betrayal had shattered me, but it hadn't destroyed me. I'd rebuilt myself, piece by piece, into someone stronger, someone who could love again without fear. And for the first time in years, I felt truly whole. Life with Emma felt different, softer, easier, and more deliberate. There were no games, no hidden agendas. She valued honesty, and her openness made it easier for me to do the same. One night, over dinner, I shared parts of my story I hadn't even told my therapist. I told her about the nights I spent awake, questioning everything I'd done wrong. I told her about the rage I'd carried, the cold determination that drove me to gather evidence against Katie. Emma didn't interrupt or judge. She simply listened. When I finished, she reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. "You're here now," she said, her voice steady. "That's what matters." The small moments with Emma became the foundation of something I hadn't thought I'd feel again: love. We spent our weekends exploring Austin, visiting food trucks, and hiking trails with Max. She brought a lightness into my life that I hadn't realized was missing. But there were still moments when the past crept in. Seeing a red-haired woman walking down the street would make my heart race, or a song that Katie used to play would bring back a wave of memories. Emma noticed those moments, and she never pushed. She gave me the space to feel, to process, and then she'd be there to pull me back into the present. One evening, while looking through old files on my laptop, I stumbled across the folder of evidence I'd gathered against Katie. The photos, the texts, the tracker logs, they were all still there, untouched since the divorce. I stared at the folder for a long time, debating whether to open it. My hand hovered over the mouse, but something stopped me. What was the point? Those files belonged to a chapter I'd closed, a version of myself I didn't want to revisit. With a deep breath, I dragged the folder to the trash and hit delete. It felt like a small victory, a step toward truly letting go. Emma noticed the change in me almost immediately. "You seem lighter," she said one morning as we sipped coffee on the porch. I smiled, realizing she was right. Deleting that folder had been symbolic, but it had also been freeing. It was a reminder that the power Katie once held over me was gone. I didn't need to hold on to the pain anymore. It didn't mean I forgot. It just meant I refused to let it define me. As the months turned into a year, Emma and I grew closer. She met my family, who adored her, and I met hers, who welcomed me with open arms. There was no drama, no tension, just the quiet, steady comfort of two people who cared deeply for each other. For the first time, I started thinking about the future in a way that didn't feel terrifying. With Emma, the idea of marriage and commitment felt like something I could embrace, not something I needed to protect myself from. But life has a way of testing you, even when you think you've finally found peace. One afternoon, I received an email from Katie. The subject line was simple: "Can we talk?" My initial reaction was anger. What right did she have to reach out after everything? But curiosity soon replaced the anger. I opened the email, my heart pounding. She wrote about how she'd been in therapy, how she was working on herself, and how she wanted to apologize one final time. She didn't ask for anything, just the chance to say what she felt she hadn't been able to say before. I debated whether to respond. Emma noticed my unease and asked me what was wrong. When I told her about the email, she didn't react the way I expected. There was no jealousy or anger, just quiet understanding. "Do you feel like you need closure?" she asked. I thought about her question for a long time. Did I need closure? Or was I content with the life I'd built without Katie in it? Eventually, I decided to reply, keeping my message brief and detached. I agreed to meet her in a neutral, public place, a cafe downtown. When I saw Katie at the cafe, it felt like seeing a ghost. She looked different, older, her confidence replaced by something quieter. She thanked me for meeting her and began to speak, her words tumbling out in a rush. She apologized again for the betrayal, for the lies, and for the pain she'd caused. She didn't make excuses this time. She owned her actions in a way she hadn't before. I listened, nodding occasionally, but saying little. When she finished, she looked at me, her eyes searching for something, maybe forgiveness, maybe closure. "I'm glad you're working on yourself," I said finally. "But I've moved on, Katie. I hope you can too." Leaving that cafe felt like closing the door on the last remnants of the past. I didn't feel anger or sadness, just a quiet sense of finality. Katie's apology had been genuine, but it wasn't something I needed anymore. My life with Emma was where I wanted to be, and nothing could change that. When I got home, I told Emma about the meeting, and she simply nodded, her hand resting gently on mine. "I'm proud of you," she said. Her words filled me with a warmth I hadn't felt in years. Months later, I proposed to Emma during a hike at one of our favorite trails. It wasn't elaborate, just me, her, and Max sitting by a quiet creek. She said yes, her eyes shining with tears of happiness. As we sat together, the past felt like a distant memory, a storm I'd weathered to reach this moment. Emma was my future, my second chance at the love I'd thought I'd lost forever. And for the first time, I felt like I'd finally found my way home. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a whirlwind. Emma and I decided on a small ceremony at a botanical garden in Austin. It was simple, intimate, just close friends, family, and Max trotting down the aisle with our rings tied to his collar. As the day approached, I couldn't help but reflect on how far I'd come. 2 years ago, I'd been broken, consumed by anger and betrayal. Now, I was standing on the cusp of a new chapter, one filled with hope and possibility. On the morning of the wedding, I found myself alone in the quiet of the garden, watching the sunlight filter through the trees. My brother, Kevin, who was also my best man, found me sitting on a bench, fidgeting with my tie. He sat down beside me, clapping a hand on my shoulder. "You okay?" he asked, his tone gentle. I nodded, though my chest felt tight. "Just a lot to process," I admitted. Kevin smiled, his eyes full of understanding. "You deserve this, Mark. You've earned it. Don't let the past steal this moment from you." His words stuck with me as I stood up and straightened my tie. He was right. This was my moment. When the ceremony began, Emma walked down the aisle in a simple white dress, her hair loose and cascading over her shoulders. She was radiant, her smile lighting up the entire garden. As she reached me, I felt a lump in my throat. The officiant spoke, the words blurring in my mind as I stared at her. This incredible woman who had become my anchor, my partner, my future. When it was time for our vows, I hesitated for a moment, my emotions threatening to overwhelm me. "You saved me," I said, my voice trembling. "You reminded me what love can be, and I promise to spend the rest of my life proving that love to you." The reception was filled with laughter, music, and warmth. Emma and I danced under the stars, the garden glowing with string lights and candles. At one point, my mother pulled me aside, her eyes misty. "You look happy," she said, her voice soft. I smiled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "I am," I said. "For the first time in a long time, I really am." She nodded, squeezing my hand. "That's all I've ever wanted for you." Her words brought a wave of emotion, and I hugged her tightly, grateful for the love and support that had carried me through the darkest times. As the evening wound down, Emma and I sat together on a bench, watching our friends and family mingle. She leaned her head on my shoulder, her hand resting on mine. "I can't believe we're married," she said, her voice tinged with wonder. I chuckled, tilting my head to rest against hers. "It feels like a dream," I admitted. But it wasn't a dream. It was real. And it was ours. In that moment, surrounded by the people who mattered most, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Life after the wedding felt like a continuation of the healing journey I'd been on. Emma and I settled into a rhythm, balancing our individual passions with the shared life we were building together. We renovated the house, turning it into a space that felt entirely ours. Her art studio filled with light and color, while my home office became a hub for the new career opportunities one was pursuing. Max, always at our heels, seemed to thrive in the energy of our home. It wasn't perfect, but it was good, and good was enough. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching a thunderstorm roll in, Emma turned to me with a question that caught me off guard. "Do you ever think about her?" she asked, her tone curious rather than accusatory. I thought about it for a moment, staring at the darkening sky. "Not in the way I used to," I said honestly. "She's a part of my story, but she's not my story anymore." Emma nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I'm glad," she said softly, "because you deserve to write a story that's just yours." Her words settled in my chest, filling the spaces where doubt used to live. A year later, we found out Emma was pregnant. The news filled me with a mix of joy and nervousness, but as the months passed, I embraced the idea of becoming a father. When our daughter, Lily, was born, I held her in my arms, overwhelmed by a love I hadn't known was possible. Looking at her tiny face, I felt the final remnants of the past fall away. Katie, Eric, the betrayal. All of it felt like a distant memory. My life was no longer defined by the pain I'd endured, but by the love I'd found on the other side. Watching Lily grow up brought a clarity I hadn't expected. The lessons I'd learned through my heartbreak became the foundation of the father I wanted to be. I wanted to teach her about resilience, about the importance of honesty and love, and about the strength it takes to forgive, not for others, but for yourself. Emma and I often talked about how much our lives had changed, how the pain of the past had shaped us but not destroyed us. It made us stronger, she said one evening as we watched Lily sleep. And it brought us here, years later. As I sat on the porch with Max at my feet and Lily playing in the yard, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this moment. Life hadn't turned out the way I'd planned, but it had turned out better than I ever could have imagined. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the anger, it had all been part of the process that led me here. I didn't think about Katie anymore. She was a chapter I'd closed long ago, a lesson I'd learned and moved past. My life was full of love, hope, and joy, and for the first time in years, I felt truly free. Thank you for watching the video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss interesting life stories, and write a comment if you like the story. See you.